how unfortunate it would be if the way the world is put together, that we are not the authors of our lives. All the scientific evidence, especially coming from the new field of neuroscience and fMRI scans of the brain and so forth, 90% or more of the neuroscientists lean towards deterministic causal explanations and say quantum physics can't possibly be involved because the brain is huge compared to quantum atomic structures. Perhaps the most important scientific evidence around the question of whether we have free will has been the work of Benjamin Libet way back in the 1980s, but it's just found so much currency today in the philosophical literature because it seems to show that something's happening in the brain significantly before the conscious will, so-called, is aware of that something has going on.
Okay, so here was the task. You're sitting in a chair, and you're supposed to flex your wrist whenever you want. And you're watching a very fast spot go around a clock face. It makes a complete revolution in about 2.5 seconds. And you're wired to two machines, so they're taking EEG readings from the scalp, seeing what's going on up there, and you're wired to a machine that will measure when your wrist muscle starts moving. And what you're supposed to do is flex whenever you want, then after you flex, you report where the spot was on the clock when you first became aware of your urge or wish or intention. They called it different things. Decision to flex now. And what he discovered in a condition where subjects were regularly reminded to be spontaneous, not to think in advance about when to do it, is that he got an EEG ramp up starting a little over half a second before the muscle started moving. It was 550 milliseconds. But the average time of first reported awareness of the intention or whatever was about 200 milliseconds, 0.2 of a second before the muscles started moving. And so he said, look, what's going on when the EEG ramp-up starts is that's when the decision is made and the person doesn't become aware of it for another 1/3 of a second. And then he generalized really to all decision-making. So whenever you make a decision, you've actually made it unconsciously before you become aware of it.
And the argument goes that this thing, a few hundred milliseconds before we become conscious of a decision whether to flick a wrist or not, indicates that this thing earlier must have caused the decision to flick a wrist or not.
There are all kinds of problems with the reasoning from the experiment, and even some problems with the experiment itself. You know, he wasn't really a firm believer in no free will, but he thought that once you became conscious of an urge to do something, you can veto it. So he thought there was this negative kind of free will. It was Ramachandran who called it free won't. So now that's some reason to believe that what Libet is picking up, you know, at half a second before muscle motion isn't a decision, but something else. And it might be part of a process that may lead to a decision. It's important, if you're going to make claims about free will, to be sure you're interpreting your data properly. And the data don't really justify the claim that these decisions are made early.
The work in neuroscience, in brain scans, has very poor spatial resolution because what it's doing is measuring the increased blood flow that goes on in different parts of the brain when we think about something or act in doing something. However, it's really gross, and so there's a serious question of whether it gives us any evidence of what's going on at the level of wherever the information is stored, in the neurons themselves, in the synapses of the neurons, or even lower.
Now, in Libet's study, remember, and in all of these neuroscience studies that followed it, subjects are supposed to be spontaneous. They're not supposed to think about when to do it. They're not supposed to think about what to do. They're supposed to be as random as they can be. So conscious reasoning has been pushed to the side in these experiments. So what about cases in which you reason long and hard about what to do, and then you make a decision? Well, there the conscious reasoning is in the process, And it might raise the probability, really, that you make your decision consciously rather than unconsciously. So the generalization is faulty.
So the scientific evidence is not proving that free will doesn't exist.
If free will is to be possible, then, how is the brain supposed to work?
One way to think about it is in terms of laws that govern brain activity or laws that govern decision making. And if the laws were exceptionless, so that if you had a certain input, you have to have a certain output, even though we ourselves as decision makers don't know what the output's going to be, it's already determined. That's one way. But suppose the laws are just probabilistic. They're not exceptionless. And so they leave room from the initial conditions to different outputs or different decisions. What would you need in the brain for that? Well, that you actually have these probabilistic processes at work. Then if you wanted to know about details, you'd have to look for quantum mechanical events in the brain, and some people think they have some evidence of that.
There is randomness in the universe. So the question is, where does it fit in? Can we get in randomness into a place in our minds if it's there? And many disagree with me. They think that the mind is too large an object to be sensitive to microscopic quantum events.
A quantum description of billiard balls is ridiculous. It's classical physics description of physics. It works just fine, and it predicts it with incredible accuracy, even though there is potentially another level of description possible. It's just not relevant to the issue. So are there quantum things going on that are affecting our consciousness? Yeah, there are quantum things. There's quantum things going on everywhere, but I mean, is it relevant to the kinds of phenomena that we're experiencing as biological beings? I don't think it is. A lot of smart people think it is. So I don't see it.
When people say to me, I do not believe that quantum events can have anything to do with thinking because they're so submicroscopic, I like to point out the eye has evolved to being able to detect a single photon, a single quantum event, the photon landing on the retina. Of course, it wouldn't do any good to evolve any farther past that, but just to show you that the brain has been able to evolve right to the quantum limit is intriguing.
The idea here is that it's an advantage to animals to randomize their behavior, and that's a survival thing, a very deep survival thing. Martin Heisenberg, he's the son of Werner, and Martin is a biologist, a very respected biologist, and he studied Drosophila, and he has shown that indeterminism, or at least random effects in their nervous system, works in a creative way for them to find food and stuff. So it's like, well, where shall I look for food? And we'll take a number of random possibilities. Michael Shadlin, who's a very respected neuroscientist who works on the brain functions of monkeys, is very much himself an indeterminist. He says we have neural noise in there all the time. The great Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, John Eccles, he believed there was some indeterminism in the brain that would be some kind of amplified quantum indeterminism. So two steps have to be involved there. There has to be the indeterminism, say at the neural level, at the synaptic level, at the firing, maybe influencing the timing of firing of the neurons. And then somehow it has to be magnified so that it has a non-negligible effects on our actual cognitive processing, so that when we're reasoning about free choices, it's not determined which way we are going to choose until we do.
For a quantum event to be able to break the causal chain of determinism, its effect would need to be somehow amplified or magnified in order to influence the brain. So how could this magnification happen?
Now, the magnification part may even be the easiest here. I mean, we know of views like Penrose and Hameroff, who have talked about large-scale quantum collapses or non-locality being an element in the brain. And Tegmark and others have shown that that's probably unlikely, given the brain is so large and so wet. For example, Christoph Koch is a very famous neuroscientist, and he rejects what he thinks is extreme views of Penrose and Hameroff and these others. But he says that there's one thing you cannot, he thinks, rule out, even if you are the toughest-minded neuroscientist, and that is that minute quantum indeterminacies at the synaptic level in the movement of particles across the cleft or even in the timing of firing of neurons might be magnified by chaos in the brain.
Chaos is a theory that describes very complex systems in which a tiny change in their initial conditions can lead to big differences later on. This is what's often known as the butterfly effect. A butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas, because weather is a complex, chaotic system. This chain reaction happens even though these systems are entirely deterministic, which means that, in theory, the outcomes are predictable, but in practice, they aren't, because the system is too complex. What Kane is suggesting here is that a random quantum event would cause a tiny variation in the initial conditions of a brain state, and that chaos would then amplify its effect to later brain states. In other words, it would be a butterfly effect in your brain.
The functioning of the brain is now known to be massively nonlinear, and chaos is an aspect of the nonlinearity, of course. And if there are such micro-events in the timing of firings, given the nonlinearity of the brain function and the massive amounts of influence of neurons going from here to there is a good chance it would be magnified and sometimes have significant effects on cognitive processing.
I think maybe a simpler way to think about it is, so there are lots of little neurons firing up until we make a decision, when we make it, and so on. And if they just were to fire a bit differently, and if it's not determined how they fire, then you could have a different output. And the output wouldn't just be at a brute neural level, it would be at a psychological level that we could appreciate. Then
it might be uncertain, what thoughts come to mind, what images come to mind, and so on and so forth. So that the whole process of deliberation, there's a lot of indeterminacy in there about what you think of next, what you're doing next, what's going to happen.
If chaos can introduce some randomness into our decision-making, then it also introduces the first major problem of libertarian free will: losing control.
If there were quantum events in our brain, that were undetermined and they somehow influenced our mental processing, how can we be in control of undetermined choices?
You are a decision-making device. That's what cognition is. You're making decisions all the time about stimuli that are impinging upon your brain. Going through the processes that lead to making a decision, you don't want some decision-making device that all of a sudden throws in a wild card. If you go out to reach for the apple, you don't want your hand going over here. You want to reach the apple. You want it to be reliable. You want it to work like a clock.
Incompatibilist views of freedom have to put the randomness somewhere. It's pretty clear you don't want to put it after the decision, because then, having made up your responsible free mind to pull the trigger, maybe you're not going to pull the trigger. You don't want that. In fact, I'm amused by the fact that we praise people sometimes. We say, they're so determined. What we mean is that once they've decided, it's going to happen. And we don't have to worry about little random flukes in there. They've made up their mind, and so we want to put it before they've made up their mind. Well, where?
So the question about what indeterminism could contribute to our ability to think freely has to do with finding a place in the brain where a quantum event would only kind of stimulate a new thought or generate a new thought, a new idea, new information. And the way I've tried to work that out is to say that free will, it's not a monolithic, instantaneous free will right there. together. Instead, we can separate them into a temporal sequence and think that the freedom part may have to do with the mind's ability to generate random new possibilities for our actions. And this thought actually goes back to William James, who first said, maybe the mind is a blooming, buzzing confusion of possibilities, and we can sometimes bet on one of those and go with it. So whatever's going on that leads to an action is in part the generation of random ideas, which, if they go all the way down to the quantum level of modern quantum physics, will be what's called deep ontological chance, randomness, pure probability. If that's then the first step in my two-step or two-stage model of free will, I like to call it, the second step will be that part of our brain which I used to call the macro mind, because it's a large enough structure in the mind that it has no access to or ignores the noise going on down at the low level that led to the ideas. So this larger structure of the mind, the neurons with their 10 to the 27 atoms in them, can average overall quantumness. And in averaging over it is what I call producing adequate determinism.
Adequate determinism is the solution to restoring lawful outcomes to random inputs. The idea goes like this. Everything is made up of quantum things. So there is, in effect, no real determinism at any level or scale in the physical universe. But because objects that are bigger than atoms contain so many individual quantum events, the random probabilities of each and every one of them become averaged over to the point of near statistical certainty through the law of large numbers, making it possible for us to predict the movement of billiard balls and planets. This is what we call determinism, but it's just a working mathematical model to predict things that are big enough to average out the quantum randomness inside each of them. Adequate determinism was therefore the bridge between microscopic randomness and macroscopic determinism, and therefore the solution to restoring our control over our actions. And according to Doyle, it's also the process that allows us to determine our own will.
The will, in my view, then, is a determination, as opposed to a determinism in the sense of predeterminism. It's a lawful determination of our actions that flows out of our desires, our feelings, our character, who we are at this moment.
And that's important. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any reliability about, moving our arms or moving our things. Or I often use an example, you go up to a coffee machine and your will is set on pressing the button for black coffee. And by indeterminism, by chance, you press another button. Well, that's not a help, that's a hindrance. A pure determinism and no introduction of indeterminism there would have been helpful, and you would have got the right button. And so, in many ways, determination, if we might call it, rather than determinism, which means globally, determination is crucial for much of our action, and so on and so forth. It's when you universalize it to every action that you get in trouble.
I do accept the idea that determinism, in a broad sense, includes the fact that much of what we are has been constituted by our past, by our genetics, by our environment, by many things that we may not be aware of. And as a philosopher, I try to look into the sources behind my actions. There are a large number of factors in all of our characters that were taught to us. We learned them, we came to accept them as part of our culture and so forth. Absolutely. But my question is, does that mean we are never, ever able to create something we never were taught?
This idea of creation is central to libertarian free will, which is why the two-stage model of free will is very similar to another model of creativity in the universe: evolution.
The first person to see it was William James. He said that, there's a remarkable parallel between free will and Darwin's evolution. Biological evolution is just in two steps. First, the errors that occur in the genetic material, which we now know to be DNA, as a consequence, at least in many cases, of a quantum random event that broke the DNA and broke the information, the code. Notice in both cases it's information that has changed in a way that was not determined by the information in the universe moments earlier. It was chance at the bottom of things which drove variations, mutations, which then open up possibilities for new species. The second stage of biological evolution is usually called natural selection. It puts that new species that's come into existence to the test of, can it reproduce? Can it live in the harshness of the environment it's found itself in? Can it survive? And if it survives better than its others, we have what's called survival of the fittest. So coming back to my model of free will, that first there's something free, then there's something willed. I like to say that the free part has to do with our thinking, that our thoughts are free. The will part has to do with our acting, and our actions we'd like, as compatibilist determinists want, our actions want to be adequately determined by our character, our motives and desires, and to decide to do something is to act and act on it is a selection process. It's a mental selection.
How does this all fit into the bigger picture of the libertarian kind of free will that says that we must be ultimately responsible for the way we are?
So the first step then is to think about how we might get the indeterminism and in what form it might arise. And I think we've done that. But look, we don't need the indeterminism for all of our acts of free will even, or even much of what goes on in the nervous system. We would hope that it would be muted or damped out, as they say it always is. It doesn't have to be there all the time. It just has to be there when we are engaged in self-formation.